propaganda actually is on a grand human scale. Yeah. Hierarchy is good. Hierarchy is needed to do things. It exists as a political class today, rather than a distinct racial group. Identity, by contrast, progressive women have to signal that they don't trust men, that men are untrustworthy and evil. We need to return to the caveman times of perfect equity. The narratives that you can build constructing fictional frameworks and media narratives in the hyper-current moment.
So this is episode 58 of the Illegitimate Scholar Podcast, and I am here with Alaric the Barbarian, which is your pen name, and you are the editor of the Dissident Review, and Volume 5 Propaganda is coming out on, May the 1st? Tomorrow, next day?
It's just about there. Thank you for having me on, by the way.
No, thank you for coming, man.
Yes, this will be the fifth edition of the Dissident Review Journal, which was initially, I started it a little over a year ago. That was initially the only thing. Now we've done republications, online articles, things like that.
Right.
And this one is going to be, it's kind of the one I've wanted to make since the beginning, in the sense of attacking propaganda narratives throughout history, looking at like politicization and just general distortions of our view of history. It's the longest one so far, and I think it's going to be one of the best looking ones so far. I'm just extremely excited for it. Obviously, you're in it with your article on anthropology and propaganda. Just a lot of really smart guys contributing to this one, and I'm very excited for the launch. I think by the time this comes out, it'll probably be live on the website.
Yeah, this won't come out till next week. It's the 30th of April right now, but this will come out next week or maybe the week after. It depends on how many I get out. But yeah, I was really excited about this one because, I love the history writing, but it's not a lot of I read all of them. I absolutely love them. But this topic was much more relatable to my regular content. So I was able to get a topic pretty easily. I did start to write that article on Francis Drake, and it just got away from me. And it turned into something huge. And I'd like to go back to that eventually because that was for the Explorers one. And Francis Drake was just incredible as what I would call like one of the first anthropologists, in the sense that he went out and he understood and he was 16th century, 1500s. He understood what Da Gama did wrong and why he got killed by natives. And he was very, very understanding of these different cultures. A little bit off topic, but yeah, propaganda. So my article was on the nature of propaganda and more of like it is propaganda, but it's more about the foundational understanding that makes you judge propaganda, which I think is, a lot of what we do on the Illegitimate Scholar Podcast and with my writing is going as high macro as you can possible to compare things. Because I think that really, it gets rid of a lot of the noise. It gets rid of I use the term social construction a lot, which people, in our space tend to think of as a bad word, but really all it means is something that is human created rather than innate, and thus innate in the realm of God rather than the realm of man. And I think going the most macro helps anybody to really see what's going on and compare things with as little bias as possible. It's always in there, of course.
Yeah, generally when you zoom out really far about any academic topic, you get a much clearer picture, even if it starts to get muddy on the details. Just because with the internet especially, everything moves so fast that there's like hyper current pieces of discourse. Like right now, the biggest thing on Twitter is the whole man, would you rather be on an island with a man or a bear question. And people will take that very micro item and extrapolate it out to, the nature of women or the nature of men, things like that. And it's just such a transient small piece of discourse. And that happens all the time. So it's very hard to get a clear picture if you just look at the micro.
Absolutely.
The more you pull out, generally, the more general you can get.
And I'm sympathetic to the idea that the micro aspects do tell us something about the macro, but it also gets way more muddied up in whatever, perceptions people have based on their cultural upbringing, their acculturation, their specific needs and wants. But yeah, that question's crazy. You want to talk about that for a second, or do you want to just move past it? Because it's probably, by the time this episode comes out, people are going to be onto something else equally as stupid.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty funny. It's just it's signaling. This is the macro view on it from my perspective. It's just signaling. Progressive women have to signal that they don't trust men, that men are untrustworthy and evil, and therefore you have to signal that whatever is anti-men, and implicitly it's white men.
Right.
If the question were framed as would you rather be on an island with a black man or a bear, it would be like, what's wrong with black people? But it's just a signaling thing. A lot of social media discourse is, and at least I try and cut through the signaling stuff and get to, what's the core issue? The core issue in this is, are men trustworthy to women? Which I think the level of untrustworthiness is massively overblown today. It was way worse even like 70 years ago.
I would say, like, maybe I'm sympathetic again to the idea that women should not trust men in general to protect themselves. Like a random man, I totally get that. Like, but at the same time, exactly. No, of course not. But to take that to the extreme and be like, oh, you know what? I'll take my chances with the bear. That's insane. Like, even if it's a black bear, and I hope that, like, I'm sure it's, I wish I knew the percentage. I can't read their minds. I can't get in their heads. But like, what, like, are you, that's not real, right? Like, that you're more likely to get hurt by a bear than a random man, no matter what other details of the man there are, race, religion, country of origin. You're more safe with the man than a bear, because a bear's going to kill you. It's going to kill you if you're in an enclosed space with it.
Well, the Zero HP Lovecraft has this post. Let me see if I can pull this up here. It's one of my favorite, like, macro level posts about what discourse is and what conversation is on Twitter, especially. Mm-hmm. Let's see. Here it is. Oh wait, nope, that's not it. That's another Zero HP post. No, it's just about women in general don't really clock the objective origin or meaning of words. It's more of like, okay, words have polarity, and whatever the polarity of a word, if it's bad, then you can just use that to manipulate somebody into a desired behavior, namely men on social media. So not cavorting to whatever their pet topic is, it's porn brained if you're on the right, or it's reactionary if you're on the left. And it's just a polarity game of, like, there's this thing that I want. Usually it's to be considered more attractive, considering it's women on social media. And they'll just take whatever bad polarity word of the day and slap it on that behavior in order to corral people into the desired one. Yeah, that's why I try and stay away from the discourse of that sort of thing on Twitter.
Yeah, it's sometimes hard to, like, not engage with that, especially when it's all over your timeline and if you post about it, it's going to get attention. But I try to. Well, now I'm banned on Twitter again, suspended, I guess. But it's hard to, like, there has to be a balance between, like, content and then engaging in that type of stuff. But both for just having an audience that's reading what I write and putting out a good product, but also for just general integrity of what I produce. I don't want to have everything I do just be based on whatever the current thing is. TM.
Yeah, that's the thing with the transient topics. They get some attention, and it's really easy to get a pretty significant degree of attention from it. But stuff that's timeless and good content attracts people much more.
Yeah, I have there's this example I always use for this. Like, there's a lot of posts and threads that I've done that are on, like, niche anthropology topics that basically get no attention at all. Like, and they're the stuff that I really want to do. Like, I most of the stuff that I post that gets the most attention, hundreds of thousands of impressions, is like it's dunking on PhDs most of the time. It's like, I think my most popular thread ever was the one about that article. You probably remember this. I think you shared it at the time, about this article, which actually really relates to the bear thing, because it was this article by these two female anthropologists, and I looked at their work. They did some really high quality work. They were doing like really good stuff on Neanderthal populations and looking at their bone structures to figure out certain things. It was really, really high quality traditional anthropology work, not any of this. A lot of the crap put out by anthropology academia today is like it's just like critical race theory, or just critical theory in general type of crap. But then they do this article where they're like, oh, men evolved to hunt, or women evolved to hunt, which is nonsense. It's not true. And the premise of their arguments and the arguments in it just didn't make any sense if you read the article, but it got them attention for the headline. It probably got more attention than anything else they've ever done. Which, you know, it's the same thing for them as it is for us posting on Twitter. And one of my favorite things I ever did, which got less than 1,000 impressions, which is crazy. If I do a bad thread, I tend to assume it's going to get 5,000 impressions. That's a bad thread. This one got less than 1,000, and it was on this. There was this dog that was sacred to a tribe or a group of tribes in the American Pacific Northwest. And they would breed them, and they were considered sacred for these people. And they would breed them for their wool, and then they had ceremonies around this dog. They would care for them, breed them very specifically, and produce like sacred objects from the wool of this dog, not through killing the dog, but through shearing the dog. And I loved it. I thought it was a great topic. I talked about it, less than 1,000 impressions, and I was like, crap, like, what am I supposed to do? I just have to keep dunking on PhDs for attention, which is fine. I enjoy dunking on PhDs, but there's a negative energy attached to that, even if it's like something that I think is really good, where, you know, I don't want to spend all my time engaged in what I would call negativity, attacking someone else. But there's a balance.
Yeah, the attack stuff gets a good amount of baseline attention just because people like conflict, but generally over time the returns on producing like original quality stuff are much higher. I mean, I've had a lot of people, like, I went through my whole DM requests the other day, which was probably 70% a cesspit of people telling me to kill myself. But
yeah,
there were a lot of people asking for like advice on writing, you know, getting big on social media. And generally my advice was, don't try and get big on social media. I didn't try to get big on social media. It wasn't like my goal. It just happened. I'm very grateful for it. I'm very happy to be here. But if you make that your goal, it tends to decline the quality of, you know, content you put out. Like one of the best posters of all time, I think at his peak he had like 10K followers, Hakan.
I'm not familiar, but go on.
Let me think. Trauma is stored in small sacs in the body. Affluent white female liberal metaphysics. He's just a very funny guy. He's very anthropologically knowledgeable, and that guy did not try to cavort to the timeline. There's a danger in dealing with social media, and one of the articles in Volume 5 actually talks about this, about how becoming reactive and sort of programmed by media can warp you in an intentional way by outside actors. It deals with the Cold War mostly, but it applies tenfold to social media, and allowing yourself to be controlled in any way by the timeline will do that. It will mess you up. So right. I like seeing people produce just good content, period, divorced from whatever the current thing TM is.
And that'll work on any platform, right? If you're producing good content that people want to see, depending on how the algorithm works, you know, there's details of the algorithm, but 80-90% of it is just making things that people want to watch. Like the YouTube algorithm, I think, is actually really, really good at the metrics that they use, you know, and there's stuff in there that blocks certain things, but their algorithm is really good at finding what people actually want to watch based on their behavior watching the content, and then pushing that content out. And if you're making good content that is retaining people, that people want to talk about and they want to share, then it gets pushed out to most people. And if you get lost in the details of all the tricks and everything, then you're not honing the right skills. There's a place for that. Like I work with a guy called Art of Purpose. He'll be on the podcast next month. Who he's a Twitter producer, and he talks about making money on Twitter, and that's more than just, you know, the ad revenue, which is peanuts. But the root of it is making good content that people want to see, and I think that if that's not your main concentration, you're starting from the wrong mindset. And I fully agree. Talking about the stuff that I want to talk about and staying niche down is what has gotten me the returns that I want. I like to call myself the premier anthropologist of the dissident right, mostly because there isn't really another one. I guess there's like Robert Seffer, and there's a couple other guys that do it, but it's very much a niche thing, and you got to find your place to fit in with something that you want to produce. And obviously I have an education degree. I quit that. I finished my student teaching and I bailed, never applied for a job or anything. I'm a certified teacher, but you know, screw that. Who wants to do that? But the biggest thing I learned in education school was about self-efficacy. And that's the idea that, like, if it's something that you like and you are self-motivated to produce it, then it's way easier to do and it doesn't feel like work. And I think that's what everybody should be going for. I'm in a little bit of a different position because I have the other businesses that I run, which provide me a mostly full-time income, so I can worry less about monetization. But even if someone's not, you still have to have that mindset, because that's what's going to work long-term.
Interrupting to tell you that the heavily requested book club is here. A Gentleman and a Scholar will be launching our first live stream Wednesday, May 8th at 8 p.m. Eastern. Typo and I will be going live to discuss the book, A True History of the American Revolution, before we read it. Then 2 weeks later, we will have another live stream to discuss the first half of the book. 2 weeks after that, the rest of the book. The book will be linked below for you to buy or find somewhere else, so you can join the discussion. After the live stream, the recording will be uploaded in audio form to the Biting the Bullet feed.
So it's that. Let's talk more about the Dissident Review. So volume 5, right? So we got propaganda. Unless you had anything else to say on that.
No, nothing else on tools.
Yeah. So my article in the Dissident Review, which I'm very happy about, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about it, as well as some of the other articles that are in there, just because it's content that this audience is going to love. I mean, I know that my audience loves the Dissident Review already. I know that they've read it, as well as Stone Age Herbalist's book. Shout out to Stone Age Herbalist, who, whenever he's got some time, is going to come back on. I can't really reach him because I'm not on Twitter. So volume 5, my article is about the foundation of how people decide, or how propaganda is.
It's a very good general look at what propaganda actually is. I mean, a lot of the other pieces deal with a direct examination of some kind of narrative or of like a campaign. The ones on COINTELPRO, that's very good. But like they're more micro. Again, they deal with like a specific topic. You and one other writer zoomed out and just wrote about propaganda generally, as its nature. Your piece more of a dissemination, or not a deconstruction, because that word is usually not a good thing, but it's a look at what propaganda, look at what propaganda actually is on a grand human scale. Yeah. And then the other one talks about positive propaganda. They're actually, I think it's right after yours. So
yeah, that makes sense. So my article, I would say, is about how the metrics through which people evaluate propaganda and how that changes over generations. One of the biggest complaints I have with American culture is the short time scale on which we view things. And I would compare that to some place like China, which views things on a generational, from a cultural level. And this is less true in the last few decades than in the past, but on a generational time scale. And this makes sense given the young age of the United States versus the absolute ancient, and I am a xenophile, people know that. If they're listening, I don't know if you know that, but I am. like the Chinese are a contemporary of the Roman Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantines, the Turks, the Ottoman Empire, all of them. They're contemporaries of everything because they start around 200 BC is when they usually mark it. Qing Shi Huangdi, who I think might have looked a lot like me and not like them, but whatever. They won't open the tomb, probably because he looks like me. But yeah, no more Yamnaya propaganda for now. But my article deals with the underlying foundational how people evaluate propaganda, which, like, anytime it's always contextual. Propaganda is always contextual. That's why the styles and what's talked about changes over time, because you have to have your button, your thumb right on the cultural heartbeat. You have to understand, and I put this into two parts in the article, human nature, for one, human nature, and then the specific culture, and then you combine those together and you get a formula for what you should produce in propaganda. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about... Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, yeah. No, I was just going to say there are some constants, we stumbled upon them mostly in the 20th century in terms of encoding them. Sex sells, that's one of them.
And that's a human
generally
nature thing. Yeah,
if you can inspire people to strong emotion, you can get them to disregard reason, most notably anger or just arousal of some sort, whether that's sexual or physical. You can get them to work around reason and hold beliefs that they otherwise would not hold. That's a pretty much a constant in human nature. And then you deal with like hyper niche cultural products. That's what a lot of the other pieces deal with. One of my favorite ones is two essays in it by Schwab, and it includes the sentence, which is for this one, this is my favorite sentence in it: "The Cold War never happened," and it just deals with the narratives that you can build by sort of constructing fictional frameworks and media narratives in the hyper current moment, and then those end up becoming the way that things are remembered, even if they're just like they're the equivalent of the man versus bear question in their day. And then they end up being taught in public school 30 years later.
Right. The amount of lies taught in public school, especially in social studies, is amazing. Or now, there are lies, but I would say also like the lies by omission and the lies by emphasis on certain things. For example, the emphasis on Martin Luther King and what they emphasize on him. So what I wanted to ask actually is, where in volume 5 is my article?
About the second third.
The second third. Okay.
Yeah. Here, I can just pull it up.
Do you like decide, like, how do you decide what goes where? Because not that, like, obviously the articles at the beginning, I would think, I don't know how you decide how you order them, but I would have thought that, and I'm not an editor of anything like this, so I don't know, but I would have thought that you would have put mine closer to the beginning as like based on the nature of the article.
See, I saw it the other way. When I order these, when I did the first one, I didn't really have a method to it. Now I do. I want to weave a narrative straight through it. And it's funny, I've ended up with the same guy starting and ending it as volume 3. Just because they write good intro and ending essays. But yours is actually, it's not the second third, it's second to last. It's immediately before LB's article on Spartan warfare poetry. Just because you look at all of these instances of propaganda, and if you start off with this very general view, you're going to try and overfit and things like that. Once you've looked at a ton of examples and a ton of examinations, then you can zoom out and you have an informed look at what this actually is and where it comes from.
Yeah, near the end would have been my other guess, besides at the beginning. At the beginning or in the end, I don't think my article would have made any sense in the middle, based on the assumedly, and we'll see when I read it, when I get it. I'm very excited to read the rest, but the very macro nature of mine. But so what else do you have to say about volume 5 before I change the topic?
In general, I mean, it's ridiculously long. The goal with this one is everything you base your worldview on was probably pushed on you often before you were even born. In terms of especially like liberal priors that people on the right still hold. For example, people will say like, oh, the FBI used to prosecute left-wing dissidents because they were a threat to the regime, but now the threat to the regime is right-wing, so they prosecute that. The reality is that since the inception of the FBI, their primary focus has been on just destroying any kind of reaction to liberal sentiment, especially under Hoover in the 70s or in the 60s and 70s, I should say.
Hoover in the 60s?
J. Edgar Hoover?
Wasn't he earlier than that?
He died in 75.
Wasn't he the president? What am I?
You're thinking of Herbert Hoover. This is a completely unrelated guy.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
J. Edgar Hoover was this is actually like one of those topics. We were talking earlier about stuff that the algorithm doesn't like. This is one of those topics for me. I know a lot about J. Edgar Hoover and a lot about COINTELPRO, which was the FBI's giant illegal surveillance and anti-dissent program for decades. It sent a letter to Martin Luther King Jr. telling him to kill himself, blackmailing him with tapes of him cheating on his wife.
Right. I've read the transcripts of those tapes. Yeah. They're pretty. I mean, obviously the way they got the information was pretty screwed up, but they're pretty damning of MLK and his morals, unfortunately. Maybe not unfortunately though, because I don't necessarily view him as a positive that much.
Well, MLK was playing the optics game in the sense of, I say Malcolm X is more honest. He was honest in the sense that, like, yes, I'm a communist to some degree. I'm a racial nationalist, things like that. MLK wanted to play the liberal consensus, despite being a Marxist and having, communist priors, generally speaking. Malcolm X didn't do that, but no, MLK thought he could be the more palatable version, and he was. I mean, he's an American civic hero because he was very good at playing the optics game.
Yeah, and I mean, the way they talk about him, and when I say they, I mean public schools and textbooks. They pick and choose what they're going to talk about.
I learned more about MLK than George Washington.
Really?
Yeah, I covered MLK every year. I covered George Washington 2 years. Yeah,
that makes sense. I don't remember how much I did, but
you learn about civil rights and the Holocaust every year to some degree. Those are like your two founding narratives.
I've probably talked to you about this before, but one of my foundational in the topic of social studies, one of my foundational experiences. I lived in Indonesia when I was younger in 5th and 6th grade, and when I lived there, when I was 10 or 11 years old, I went to Cambodia with my dad and my mom. And, excuse me, when I went to Cambodia, I went to the killing fields, literally called the killing fields. And to be honest, I don't think my dad should have brought me there at 11 years old. Cambodia is like Thailand's Mexico, so it's like even more lawless than Thailand, which is like already pretty lawless. So like these weren't, it's not like a Smithsonian museum. You go to this place and there was police caution tape around an area where they had a baby's bone on the ground, from where apparently we were told by a guide who had survived this genocide, which killed a third of the population, where a baby had been swung against a tree. And then we go to this place that used to be a school, and then it was an internment camp for people that were being killed. And it was gnarly, man. It was really gnarly. And then I came back to the United States after 2 years, and, we're always talking about the Holocaust and never again and all this stuff. And I'm like, wait a minute, what do you mean never again? Like, what about Rwanda? What about Cambodia? Yeah. Why does no one care? Like,
happened again 20 minutes later.
Yeah, it's still happening. What are you talking about? But yeah, they don't like that, which has really informed a lot of my opinions over the years, is that people don't care. It's not as close to them. But for me, the image of a literal pyramid of skulls is burned into my brain. So I'll never forget it. And I care about Asian lives. I don't know, maybe other people don't, but but I do. I know there's a lot of them, but goddamn, guys, they're still people.
They seem to be a lot more casual in Asia with human life on a grand historical scale. I mean, you look at
Absolutely.
battles in Chinese history, and it's like, oh, 7 million dead, and this was a small skirmish.
Yeah.
It's just unfathomable. Like, that's Stalingrad. It's just nuts.
Part of that, I think, from an anthropological perspective, has to do with the carrying capacity of rice versus wheat. So it's like 3 to 4 times, and this is true of corn, maize as well. There's a carrying capacity of 3 to 4 times the population, and they are also both more labor intensive. So I think that creates a situation where human life is valued less. And
there's more of it, and it's more interchangeable.
Right. And then, of course, you have in the high and late Middle Ages, you have the Black Death, which is correlated with a increase in Western Europe. Eastern Europe, Western Europe had more of serfdom in around the early modern period in the high and late Middle Ages, which turns into more egalitarianism over time. Whereas in the East, the opposite happens, and they turn more. And when I say East, I mean Near East. I mean like Russia.
Yeah.
They have their rights as the peasants get taken over time, whereas the opposite happens in the West. And I tend to. So you're probably familiar with Fukuyama, right?
Yeah.
So. Right. So he's very famous for the end of history, which unfortunately is kind of garbage. Maybe not garbage, but it doesn't work. It's not correct. But I am a huge fan of Fukuyama's 2-volume series on political order. I think that it is an incredible book that everybody should read. And this is on political establishment, and he makes an argument in there. I think it was in this. There's a couple other books that deal with this. That systems of governance that are more what's the word, or that are less exploitative. So if they're not as serfdom based, if they're not as or slavery, serfdom or slavery, or you have like the encomienda system, which is kind of serfdom in Latin America, I think that long term doesn't produce it doesn't produce a long lasting culture. Whereas when you have a culture that it's promoting these ideas of people being able to do the work that they want to and succeed in it, which you have in, as an Irish Catholic, it's unfortunate, but in more of the Protestant countries, the Northern European countries, I think that produces over time, people are doing what they want to. It's back to the self-efficacy thing, that people are going to produce more. They're going to produce things that are better. And he uses and I'm not explaining this very well. I haven't read it in years, but he uses the example of Argentina, I remember, as like, he was like, yeah, Argentina falling back from a first world country into, I guess there's still a first world country, but they used to be, right. The definitions of first world, it's like people talk about it in terms of wealth, but it used to be based on like Cold War. First is aligned with the US, second is with Russia, and third is neither. But yeah, Argentina used to be richer than the U.S. and now it sucks. And I feel for my Argentinian brothers, but it's the way it goes.
Well, I'd push back on that thesis. I know what you're referring to. I haven't read Fukuyama in a long time, but my pushback on that is generally that slaving or highly ordered societies with a large chunk of the population that do nothing but work, they produce less cultural content that's memorable over time, but they tend to produce the best works. The Greeks were like this. When you have an aristocracy that is sort of ordered or expected to engage in culture production as one of their main modes of existence, really, you need the lower class to support that in the sense of, like Victorian England had this. Some of the greatest, in my opinion, at least, some of the greatest writing, just like basic audience writing, came out of Victorian England and contemporaries in the U.S. And that was a very divided society by class. You had people that were essentially of the leisure class, and they were able to produce a lot of, great books, research, media, things like that. We don't really have that as much today. The leisure class that we have is largely propagandists. The people that run like indigenous lesbian poetry circles and go to 5 protests a week. That's our leisure class, realistically speaking. Our financially successful, our barons of industry and things like that are not very good at leisure. You look at Elon Musk, that guy's not sitting in his summer home and on the beach doing nothing for a while and just thinking about life. That was sort of the expected mode of, we'll say, like a 1854 through, let's say 1854 British aristocrat. You're expected to kind of do that every once in a while. You're not expected to do that now. Part of that is the Protestant work ethic, the sort of very German method of thinking that we have here in the U.S., but it seems to apply globally in that elites are not expected to do culture production. That's supposed to be a separate class of artists or thinkers. You go to Greece, which is our foundation of how we think about everything, and they were kind of expected to spend their time in athletic training and thinking about stuff.
Right.
That's how you get Plato.
Yeah.
So there are exceptions to that, generally, is my thought.
So comparing Victorian England to some of these other places, in Victorian England, I wouldn't say that this is the time of industrialization, at least towards the latter half. I would compare Victorian England to a place like China at the time, or a place like Russia at the time. Whereas, there are issues with Victorian England for the lower classes and how they're treated. But at the same time, there is an element of choice, which I'm saying in a neutral sense rather than a positive sense, because I'm not sure it's good. But when people are not forced to work on the farm, like they can choose to stay on the farm and they can choose to work there, but they can also choose to move into the city, then you have it's an element of self-efficacy, of self-motivation that allows people to go to where ideally they're going to be of the most production to themselves as well as to the greater culture. And a lot of times, I think the result of that today is ultimately rent-seeking behavior that does really screw up our culture. But I think it did produce, it produced more than a place like China, which would have been totally fine if no one came in to screw up the Middle Kingdom. But unfortunately, the destabilizing effects of things like the Opium Wars and the precursors to the Opium Wars, which is just the opium in general, is something that they weren't able to defend against, of these outside forces that were allowed by in Western and Northern Europe the changes to their culture.
Yeah, that's fair. That's a fair pushback. I'm thinking of things in the sense of aristocraticism, and like you don't get great expectations in ancient Greece. You don't get that. Your station is rather fixed. You don't have a helot becoming anybody.
Right.
There are some forever.
Right. But in Greece and Rome, though, there were examples of like, you could say high class slaves, in the sense that, the traditional version of slavery, before slavery becomes intertwined with the new ideas of capitalism in the early modern period, which I think, like, I don't want to. This is used a lot today to talk about or to push the idea that somehow the slavery that was practiced in the United States was worse than anything else in history, which I don't think is true. I think it was different. I don't think it was necessarily worse. I think it was just different. To say it's worse, you have to create some sort of metric to judge that by. And as somebody who views everything from the macro sense, I don't think that that's very useful. But With the traditional style of slavery, which is war captives, I mean, you could take somebody as a slave who has a lot of skills and wouldn't traditionally be like a enslaved in serfdom or something, which I've talked about this before, but my view on serfdom is that it is essentially slavery. And indentured servitude as well. Like, you're familiar with the 1619 project that, Pig Swale, right? Something I learned recently was that 1619 actually wasn't when the first slaves were brought to the United States in the modern idea, but when the first black Africans were brought in, they were brought in as indentured servants. So they were actually freed after 7 years, just like anybody else. The racism comes later, intertwined. And I think people view this kind of in a linear sense that the racism maybe went down over time, but it wasn't linear. It was up and then down. It wasn't. Things were less racist in the 17th century than they were in the 18th, and then in the 19th they get less racist, and then again in the early 20th century more racist. But
the problem with any of these debates that deal with the sort of actual technical nature of something like American slavery or indentured servitude is that you're arguing an academic perspective. You're arguing against people who are advancing a religious perspective, essentially, that is some degree of racial, the darker you are, the better thinking. Mm-hmm. It's Malcolm X type stuff. It's based on that, at least, but it's mostly advanced by white people who feel guilty. And they're not advancing any kind of actual technical argument that makes sense. I mean, we've seen academics and activists and things like that just get blown up on social media for making factually ridiculous assertions for, 10 years now? The thing is that never changes their view, and it's never going to change their approach, because their approach is that of a priest rather than a and I'm using priest in the technical sense, not that I dislike priests, just they're pushing a religious view of Black people are the ultimate victim of world history. They're essentially the ultimate victim of Western civilization. Therefore, white people, it's a racial narrative fundamentally. And you just can't get them out of that. Like, to them, American slavery is the worst because we did it, and we need to justify hating American white people, things like that. Mm-hmm. Like, it's circular. It's not, they don't care about the actual, facts of it.
Anybody who's listened to the podcast for a while is going to be familiar. I did a 3 or 4 episode series on the anthropology of religion, and the comparison I did make directly the comparison of professors as a priest class, and like I fully believe that wokeism, which I define in those episodes, because people will deny that it's a thing, which is incredibly stupid to deny that a intangible term that you define is a thing. It's just that's it's a thing. I promise you, it's a thing. They'll deny it. These same people will deny it. But yes, I absolutely view the professors as the priest class. And the word sacred gets thrown around in the anthropology of religion. And sacred beliefs are things that are kind of untouchable. And that seems to be what the view of racial politics in the United States comes down to, is that it is a sacred thing that you're not allowed to touch. You're not allowed to have discourse on. And it moves away from what I would view as actual academia, and actual academics. And there's a lot of things like this. If you're ever looking at a historical topic, and there's many of these, I don't even think I should mention the one that I'm thinking of right now to defend my YouTube as I'm off on Twitter. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. Yeah. But if there's an estimate, for example, of a certain number of people killed, and it's clearly an estimate because it's a nice round number, maybe one that begins with 6, and you're not allowed to challenge that number in any way, then that is no longer an academic pursuit. It's no longer a historical argument. It's no longer historiography. It's something that is sacred and untouchable, and that's the realm of religion. That is not the realm of academics or of history in general.
Well, yeah, that's certainly one of the, if there were 10 commandments of the American civic religion, that would be one of them. Another would be that racial equity is a general idea, and then followed by any disparity shown between racial subgroups is the result of oppression by white people, explicitly by white people, or quote unquote systems, which is a stand-in for just white people as a concept, because obviously white people run all the systems. It's going so well for us right now.
Yeah, of course we do. That's why the executive branch. That's why the executive branch is all white people, right? Okay, I'm getting a little too far out there. But look up who's in the executive branch, who might be a extraordinarily disproportionate representation as a small percentage of the population. And maybe they're white, maybe they're not. I don't know.
Well, here's what I think about that angle. I just mean in general, even if you had, let's say an all WASP executive branch, and that there are certainly like WASPs and things like that, but they're not serving the interests of white people in the racial sense that, let's say, black politicians are serving their black constituents.
Absolutely.
It's a myth, frankly, that America is like a white supremacist country. In fact, we've been an anti-colonial, anti-white supremacy country for 70 years. The CIA explicitly pushed this during World War II and in the post-war era via Hollywood. Another great Schwab article there. The FBI crushed out any kind of like legitimate white supremacist group in the 60s. It's a myth, and all of the narratives that arise out of supporting that myth they end up cementing themselves in your worldview. For example, like the idea that let me think of a potent one. Deploying the National Guard to stop anti-desegregation protesters. Right. That's like a pivotal moment in American history, and it's like a good thing. That was not a good thing. That was an insane abuse by the president in service Johnson? Of the actual belief of the American government and the American, we'll say, like priestly class, which is that white people are tainted with a form of racial original sin. And that no other group can do bad just because white people have caused all of the problems in world history. Like that's the explicit founding belief of the modern American order. And everything you learn in public school generally goes toward that. The end result is, some form of leftism or communism with a racial tilt to it.
Yeah.
And that's been us for 70 years, and nobody wants to acknowledge it.
Yeah, I fully agree. And a little bit before that, I want to touch on something. So the idea of white people as a concept, like people think about America. When I say people, I mean like college students, professors. Like the idea that America was a white supremacist country for very long, I would say is just ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous. And when I say this, I have to elaborate on this because I've caught flack from both sides for this. This is probably the thing that I get attacked by people on the right the most, is when I bring up that race is a social construct. And when I say that race is a social construct, what I mean is that there are different definitions of what race means in different times and places. For example, in the UK, on the UK census, there are different categories for people to place themselves in versus in the United States. Like on a UK census, they have Irish as a racial class. In the United States, we have what essentially lines up with these old ideas from the 1800s of Negroid, Caucasoid, and Mongoloids. That's essentially where our race comes from, but they call them Caucasian/white, Black/African American, and then Asian/Pacific Islander now, but it essentially covers the same thing. But America was never a country that, well, okay, so maybe it was at certain points, but like we talk about the 1800s, 1700s, 1600s, it's Northern European, Western European. It's French, German, English. It's explicitly not Irish Catholics. It's explicitly not Scottish Catholics. It's not these other people. It's Protestant. You get into the 1800s, the Irish are, and as much as academia wants to say that it's not true, it's ridiculous to say that the Irish were not extraordinarily oppressed in the United States. And look, I'm Irish. Most of my blood is Irish, like 60 to 75% of it. But I don't want reparations for that. That is the reality of the situation. And the idea that there was this concept of white people that included all of the groups that we call white today is completely not supported by any of the evidence. Like in the 1920s, when I would say if you're being generous, the time where America was a white supremacist country in the context of what we think about race today, the most generous way that you could view this is between like 1910 and maybe 1960, there is this idea of white people. But at the same time, my dad, who was half Irish, half Hungarian, is half Irish, half Hungarian, and my mother, who is full Irish. My dad lived in a Catholic neighborhood in the 1950s. He was segregated in a Catholic neighborhood in the 50s. And this is after World War II, when you have the creation of this class of white people. Whereas you go to the 1920s and you have the Ku Klux Klan, the second one, not the one from the mid 1800s, which I would view more as a old guard thing rather than being like, obviously their racial aspect is there, but the 1920s, there are a lot of burnings of Catholic churches, attacks of Catholic people. Notre Dame, the Fighting Irish, they get their name from fighting the KKK. And I've said it before, and I'll say it again. I don't think Catholics should have ever been allowed in the United States. And I say that as a Catholic because it doesn't make sense. Oh, race.
No, you're good. The second KKK was more of a populist movement as compared to the first one, which is more of an aristocratic movement. And I use aristocratic in a technical sense here. But I mean, these guys were like aristocrats in the literal sense as well. They were quoting Homer. You know, the second wave KKK was not like that. They were much more of a populist movement, but based on anti-Catholic sentiment.
Explicitly, they were not a white organization. They were a Protestant organization. I mean, they wouldn't have, like, the idea that a Catholic person would join the KKK, the second one, the 1920s, is, I mean, it's as crazy as a black person. It's just as crazy. They wouldn't let you in. Yeah, and there were a lot of lynchings of Catholics.
There just weren't Catholics to join it.
No. And that one was more, it was more regionally to the south. And this results from this military occupation that we colloquially call Reconstruction, but really it's just like the 1960s. It's forcing a rule of law on people who don't want it to be there. It's the same thing that we tried to do in Afghanistan. It's the same thing that's happened many times over history. And I think I actually referenced this in my article in Volume 5, or I referenced things like this. When you try to impose rules on people and take away their power, they're going to fight back, and that's what happened. But the concept of white people, like, there's references in the 1600s and the 1700s of these aristocratic English people calling themselves Anglo-Saxon, or not Anglo-Saxon, but Norman. They're calling themselves Norman. They view themselves as distinct from their own white populations, what we would call white today. There was even an attempt to create a serf class of white people to act as a barrier. So at the top, you have these Norman aristocratic English people. In the middle, the attempt, it wasn't actually taken into fruition, a serf class of Anglo-Saxon people. And then on the bottom, of course, you have the African slave class.
The thing with white today is that white's a political class. It's not, you're correct in that it's not a very succinct racial descriptor, but it's a political class in America. And it's very easy to tell who's white in the sense of, are you a member of that political class? And it's just, do you get dispensation and benefits from the regime? If you get them, you're not white.
Yeah.
So if you're of African descent, if you're Middle Eastern, Hispanic, Asian, broadly, you get white people privilege, or you don't get white people privileges, which I use as kind of an oxymoron because it's, everybody else gets some form of benefit. It exists as a political class today rather than a distinct racial group. Obviously, there are much deeper distinctions within white people, and there always have been. But even you look back to like the 16th century, you look at the Battle of Lepanto and things like that, there was a conscious effort of Europe as a single entity, of white people and Christendom as a cohesive thing. It wasn't in the sense that they were going to, all hold hands and sing Kumbaya, the French and the Italians and the Dutch and the Swiss and the English. That just wasn't going to happen. But there was some form of identity by contrast. And the contrast at this point was to the Turks, which are, I'd say, genetically distinct from modern Turks. It was a much more diverse regime and people at the time. Just generally, it was like, okay, we're lighter in color and we are Christian. They are darker in color and they are Muslim. That was your distinction.
Yeah.
They also had just different norms of warfare and things like that heightened it. But yeah, you do see some nascent form of identity by contrast, and that's what it is today, is a political identity. Yeah. Rather than a distinct, we're from these places and things like that. Like Boers are white. Boers are not from Europe for centuries.
Right.
But they're still very much white people. They're kind of like ultimate white people in the sense that they get, trashed on by everybody. They're like the worst white people because they're still colonizers,
Yeah.
So you get weird things like that. Just today, it's a political class.
And it is. And to be honest, a lot of Asians end up fitting into that. East Asians, especially, they're functionally white in the sense that they don't get these other benefits, just like white people like us. And that results from
benefits.
Their perception.
Yeah.
In the sense
that they can still, you can be Chinese and say, I am oppressed. Like, that's a sentence that you can actually say without getting eviscerated in the public square. Yeah. You can't be Irish, French, Slovenian, Finnish, whatever. You can't be white and say that.
I mean, I will. I'm oppressed. I'm not, but I'll say it.
Well, that's the thing. Like, I don't see anything wrong with oppression as a thing. It's just a fact of humanity and human society. You're going to have order to your society. You're going to have hierarchy. Hierarchy is good. Hierarchy is needed to do things. And then we just twist this into white people bad, original sin. And the problem is that there's so many evolutions of this idea over time that it's hard to even get back to the root of it. And everybody tries to get back to the root of it. Oh, it's you'll get different explanations of it's an outgrowth of like Jewish Frankism. It's an outgrowth of Puritanism. It's inherent to Christianity. It started with Marx, or you'll take it back even further. It started with the Enlightenment, things like that. You just get radically different views on it. I don't really think it matters to any meaningful extent. You can do an intellectual genealogy any way you want, as long as the end result is the same. And that end result is, okay, like a significant portion of our society and civic religion are dedicated to a nonsense belief in white people caused everything bad in the world, and we need to return to the caveman times of perfect equity. And there are like 15 different issues in those two sentences alone. So
there are a lot.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, if you want to
about the caveman stuff. I say caveman in the sense of primitive society. Like Howard Zinn sort of promoted that with the Arawak of it was a feminist progressive paradise.
It's insane. What people will argue exists in primitive. I use the word primitive, but I always put a quotations on it because that requires you to, say what primitive is. But the idea that like once you get to horticulturalist societies, it's hunter-gatherers might be more egalitarian, but really in a sense it has a lot more to do with them viewing status in a different way rather than a rather than something that's innate. I mean, they weren't egalitarian. They aren't egalitarian. And a lot of what we think of today as hunter-gatherers are more like horticulturalists. And when you're in horticulture, there is an element of oppression. For example, from my own state, the Pequot, they're now split into three groups, one of them in Ohio, two of them in Connecticut. I won't get into the details of how that happened, but some of it was caused by European action, some of it wasn't. But you have like the Pequot, the shape of Connecticut comes from the territory that the Pequot ruled over. So the Pequot are from like what's now New London County, which is where I'm from, in southeastern Connecticut. But they ruled over in the sense that they were getting tribute from all of the other tribes from the rest of Connecticut. And as far as I know, the Pequot today, they were the leaders of this place. And when the Pequot War happened in the 1630s, the Connecticut colony is formed out of the territory that was nominally controlled by the Pequot. None of the other tribes that existed at that time besides the Pequot, and again, there's three versions of the Pequot. There's three distinct federally recognized. I think all three of them are federally recognized. And none of the other ones exist in any real way. I'm sure, and I'm sorry that I'm sure none of them are listening right now just based on the population levels, but there are other Native American groups from Connecticut that are not federally recognized, and they were the ones who were the oppressed at the time by the Pequot. And that carries into today, even though the Pequot were the ones who were defeated in that war, to them continuously not having the power exercised by a federally recognized tribe. I'm not going to get too far into that. That's a contemporary Native American issue, and I always try to bring up contemporary Native American issues when I bring up Native Americans. Have I told you about why? Have I told you about that conversation?
Not off the top of my head. We've talked about natives before, but
yeah. So I'll tell it again. Longtime listeners will have heard this, but I haven't talked about it in months. I met a guy. There was one guy I met who was a Mohawk, which is one of the Haudenosaunee Iroquois tribes. Mm-hmm. Mohawk might be the European word. I don't remember, but and the other guy was half Cherokee, which is related to the Iroquois Haudenosaunee, like their language family, but they're not like part of the Iroquois Confederacy, which was is still up in upstate New York and into Canada. And I was talking to him, I talked to these guys for like an hour. It was a great conversation. And I was talking to them about history, just like I would, if I met a French person, I'm going to talk to them about French history. I love history in general. But he said to me, I love that you're into the history and everything, and I remember he put his hands together. He was like, please, please, please remember that we are still here. So I don't like to talk about Native Americans in a past tense. I like to remind people that they're still here, and the Pequot are doing okay. They're doing pretty decent. They weren't like 50 years ago, but today they're doing pretty well. They're one of the richest tribes up there with, I think, the Cherokee, the North Carolina Cherokee. There's 2 or 3 groups of Cherokee, but the North Carolina Cherokee are incredibly rich. And you can compare that to like the Navajo and a bunch of other tribes, some of the tribes in the Pacific Northwest. They are living in absolute squalor, like third world status, like average income, $18,000 a year. You have to either give up your entire culture to leave and get a job, or you just stay and your life sucks, which is a terrible situation to be in. But yeah, that's
pretty much 2 options. It's either, reservation poverty, which is pretty much across the board in a lot of reservations, mm-hmm. or casino rich, colloquially.
Yeah.
It's a tough spot to be a Native American. That part of it is sort of not an unwillingness to adapt, but an unwillingness to, I guess adapt is the word, adapt cultural practices to the modern world. You have Europeans that had fairly similar, very connected to the earth cultures that adapted that over time with technological and industrial shifts, and I'll say economic shifts. And you just don't see that with Native Americans, partly because it happened so fast here. So I'll give them credit there. It happened very, very fast here. But just in general, yeah, it's a rough spot to be Native. I've met a couple of guys, and they're, they generally bemoan the same things. It's like, everybody drinks, everybody's unhealthy, nobody has money. It sucks. Yeah. We kind of have a culture, but not really.
It's awful.
It's unfortunate. But that's the thing, though. Like with go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Yeah. With the Howard Zinn, the Arawak mythos, it was very convenient for the Arawak because the Arawak aren't still here. They're not a group. They don't have any kind of recognition. And if they had seen Zinn's characterization of, let's just say the native people of Hispaniola, to what extent they even still exist, if they had seen Zinn's characterization of their ancestors as like abortion-loving, egalitarian progressives with very loose sexual morals and things like that, they probably would take issue with it.
They would probably kill him.
Yes, just as
like
yeah.
The Arawak were warlike. The Arawak were very warlike. And I'm saying that in a comparison to the other tribes in their area, they were incredibly violent.
Yeah, no, okay. It was the different tribe that was often taken as slaves. That was, they were as well. But I just remember in Columbus's diary, one of the bits that Zinn quotes is Columbus saying, something about like how they're, polite and generous, and then ... And then it's like 7 pages later, which is not stated, but he says they probably make good slaves because a lot of them had scars from like battles and things. And he asked about what they were, and they, pantomimed to him that people came on slave raids. Because it was a slaving place, just like every culture has generally some form of captive taking and things like that. That's a near universal human behavior, is forced labor and captive taking.
And it does depend on the. So like, and this is what I'm talking about when I talk about like how people view slavery in the United States. They're like, oh, it was so evil because of this. And it's like, you're creating the metrics by which you're then judging this thing. Like they created the metrics to then judge this poorly. But if you look at like in the United States, as far as I know, the literal slavery that we would view as slavery today, it's I think that pre-European in North America. Obviously you go to Central America and there's slavery, and that's not negotiable. Like that was a thing. But based on the level of political development, like horticulturalists, like the Eastern Algonquins in New England, they don't have a political structure that allows for slave taking. These are semi-nomadic people. They're not going to have literal slaves. It just doesn't fit into the rest of their culture. So they would have, like I talked about earlier with the Pequot, they're going to have a tributary system with these other cultures. And that's not, it's probably like, in that case, I would view it as better because people still get to kind of live their lives, but it's not like that. It's still an element of servitude. Whereas then you go into the Tlingit and the Haida in the Pacific Northwest, which is an area that has a higher level of political development. And when I say a higher level of political development, we usually don't like to talk about it in a linear sense of the progression of civilization, but in the sense that their higher level of political development allows them to, what'd you say?
Just that it was more complex. I think that's the descriptor I've often seen.
Right. So complex, definitely more complex, but even that has an element of like, how do you define complex? So the way I like to view it is the amount of people and density that their political structure allows. And with horticulturalists like the Eastern Algonquins, who practice some hunting and gathering, and some not to the level of agriculture, but they are planting crops. They're planting the Three Sisters, beans, corn, and squash, in the Eastern Algonquin territories. And later this week on the YouTube, I'm going to come out, or this will probably be out by this time it comes out. I have an interview that I'm going to be posting with a Mississippian culture archaeologist who worked on some connections between the Mayan culture into the Mississippi River Valley. That seems, to me, it was very convincing. And this is sort of a new idea, besides in niche anthropology circles, that the Mayan culture exported itself into the Mississippian culture, connected to the cultivation of maize. But
Well, in order for that to be true, you'd have to have more significant cultural transmission than we think of. And
I hope you'll watch what I put out, because it's pretty insane what he brings up. It's
I agree
really
with it.
good.
That's the thing. I think it's definitely true. And one of the things that would be really compelling is if you could trace some Incan influence to any degree north, because that would imply some level of civilization, or at least passage through the Darien Gap on a regular basis, because none of these people were seafaring to any serious extent. And that would comport with some other, esoteric archaeology stuff, like Richard Marsh finding pyramids in the Darien that shouldn't have been there.
I don't know anything about that. I'm going to write that down. You said Richard Marsh?
Richard Oglesby Marsh. Yeah, it's White Indians of Darien. He was part of.
Oh, yeah. You just did that. I got to read that. Yeah, I got to order that.
White out of stock right now, so I sold out. So
okay. So
I'll just send you a
Darien,
link to the PDF.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate that. The Darien Gap, is that like that's somewhere in the Panama Canal?
Yeah, it's in Panama. It's a really, really crappy section of land that you can't really build anything on because it's marshy and mountainous at the same time. Everything there wants to kill you, and it sucks. It's completely undeveloped today. They couldn't even build the Pan American Highway through it.
Right. Yeah. And there is that geographical barrier there. And I should say, on the seafaring topic, the geography of the Americas doesn't really lend itself to needing seafaring, besides in the Gulf of Mexico and Cuba. So sometimes people don't produce certain things just because it doesn't make sense for them to produce it. For example, I got in the only time I've heavily disagreed with bog beef and Marbleck was when we were talking about the invention of the wheel, and how the Native Americans didn't invent the wheel. It's well, they had toys that had wheels, and they didn't have pack animals, so they couldn't really use wheels. The Incans use skids a lot. But regardless, yeah, I don't know about the thing with the Incans versus into the Mayans and the Aztecs. I think it's pretty well established that the Aztecs adopted culture from the Mayans. Either that, or they both adopted from.
It's always compelling because we don't really know that much about it. All of our sources are kind of outdated. The people that are the descendants of those cultures today are, practically speaking, not that well connected to their pre-Columbian ancestry. Yeah. They're decently connected, but they're not as well connected historically as, let's say, North American natives are. They don't have that same level of continuity.
I think so there are certain places in Mexico. So if you go to the two states on the Yucatan Peninsula, which I've been to, Quintana Roo, which is where Cancun is, and then the actual state of Yucatan. Both of them are on the Yucatan Peninsula. If you're talking to a Mexican person, you can't talk about the Yucatan Peninsula because they hear Yucatan and they think the state rather than the peninsula, which also includes Quintana Roo. But there are a lot of people there that are blood Mayan, fully. You go to cities and they're Mayan.
The language is still alive.
Yeah, multiple languages. There are many Mayan languages. The problem is that you don't know how much of what they know is muddied up with Spanish colonialism affecting their culture. And this is a problem we have pretty much everywhere, because very quickly when cultures interact with each other, they adopt. And this happens both ways. This is cultural diffusion. I did an episode on cultural diffusion, which is how cultures spread. They adopt each other's ideas. So, for example, I made a dugout canoe, or I carved out a dugout canoe based on a archaeological find from the 1500s, because I went as far back as I could, because very quickly you have Native Americans in these Eastern Algonquins in New England, what's now New England. They are they start using metal on their boats, which the English call Irish boats, Irish canoes, because that's where they knew of dugouts. That was their frame of reference. But very quickly in the archaeological record, you find in dendrochronology, which is the dating of trees, it works pretty well, but it still gives you a range. So the find that I based my canoe on, this 12-foot Eastern Algonquin find, may have actually even then been influenced by these whalers who were coming over, not settling. They didn't settle until the 1600s, largely because the population density was too high in that area. But they do come in and they do spread culture, and they do they talk about technology, they exchange metal, things like that. And the Native Americans, these Eastern Algonquins, they very quickly changed the way that they're making their dugout canoes, which were largely used on the river systems, like Connecticut, which, by the way, Connecticut means Great Tidal River. So when you say Connecticut River, which goes through not only Connecticut, but up through New England into the Great Lakes, you're actually saying Great Tidal River, which is one of my little fun facts. But they adopt these technologies. They also, there's other examples of this where they did take certain guns, they didn't take others. They learned the technology quickly. They learned what they could use and what they couldn't fit in. They took, if they traded for like brass pots, they would, there's examples of them cutting up the brass pots to make, or copper rather, not brass, copper pots so they very quickly adopt, like they take the copper from these pots. They don't have use for pots. They're horticulturalists. They're not using them. They use wicker baskets, things like that. And they cut up the copper pots and they made copper tipped arrows, which could punch right through this 17th century padded armor that the English and the Dutch settlers are wearing.
Yeah, and then you see the inverse with Mesoamerican cultures. I mean, you have guys fighting in the Philippines of the 1600s whose like fathers and grandfathers were, they still were full blood, we'll say Aztecs, because they were probably warriors previously or from warrior families. And they're fighting in the Philippines for the Spanish, wearing cuirasses and fighting with swords and bucklers.
Yeah.
Like they're not using obsidian clubs anymore.
Nope. Nope.
Yeah, it goes both ways, and it makes it very difficult to really hack something out from, especially pre-colonial Spanish. They didn't keep as like autistic of records as the English did.
And a lot of them were
also
destroyed, unfortunately.
Yeah, and interbreeding with them too was a lot more severe than with the English settlers. So
right,
the cultural,
it's a much larger population.
Yeah.
There's some other factors in that as well.
Oh, of course. Those are just the first two that come to mind for me.
Right. No, I mean with the spreading of the population, culturally the Spanish interbred a lot more. But then you also have, even in a less dense area, you have the population of First Nations in Canada, this Métis or Métis population that is a mix of French and Native, and it becomes its own culture over time, which creates some issues in Canada today for the people that are descendants of that, because there are special classifications in Canada, just like there are in the U.S. for Native people, First Nations in this case. And they, the Métis people kind of don't fit into either white or Native. So sometimes it creates this legal issue where they're neither. And it's in the court system, it kind of gets jumbled up.
So yours is second to last, describes propaganda. And then the last one's sort of an exhortation from LARPing Values on Twitter about Spartan war poetry and positive propaganda. So it's kind of this nice wrap up of, you read all of these specific dissertations. I mean, mine's on homosexuality and just general sexuality throughout history. We have another one on transgenderism and the history of it. And then, things like that. So controversial hot topics, then you get a broad overview in your work on it. And then you get an exhortation to go make good propaganda.
I think that's a perfect. I think that's a perfect order at the end there. You want to talk about, do you want to talk about like some of the other articles in there that you're interested in discussing? I really,
yeah, absolutely.
Anybody, please buy the book. Link will be in the description of both the podcast and the YouTube.
Yeah, let me pull this up here. You've read previous editions, so Justin Jeffrey, he usually does the esoteric ones. It'll just be like an incredibly in-depth piece about a Native conflict in colonial Virginia, and then you realize it's actually the origin story for Mothman. Like it's the actual cultural origin of the myth. He does stuff like that. He did one on archetypes, on necromancers, vampiric tyrants, things like that. So it's a Faust and Vlad the Impaler are the primary focuses on how those figures are weaponized as propaganda. Not necessarily weaponized, just used. Great piece on kept journalism in Italy under Mussolini. That's actually from the press secretary of the Texas Attorney General.
Wow.
Crazy that guy wrote an article, but it's a very good piece on generally how journalism can be manipulated and how it's manipulated today. Then it's my piece. I don't know, I'm going to publish it like separately online when volume 5 comes out. So I get kind of I don't want to go into too much depth if the piece is going to be public very soon anyway. Some Roman stuff from another returning writer, and then the Cold War duology, the premise of that being that the space race didn't exist. It was an entire media construction of like the framing of the space race. Like we knew that the Soviets were going to launch Sputnik. We 100% knew. We actually had collaborated with them on protocols that would be used in Sputnik over the International Geophysical Year, the entire year previous. And then as soon as they launched Sputnik, which was very well forewarned, the U.S. media obviously launched a whole thing of the Russians have put something in space. They beat us. We've got to mobilize and beat them. And that's how you get the space race. So things like that, where it's in the moment propaganda that now, as we look back historically, we see as an immutable historical truth rather than the actual truth, which is that it was a propaganda narrative in the moment. And then the second part of that essay deals with science fiction and the Cold War, all the media narratives around it being essentially an act of science fiction, partly by science fiction writers. So you get things like the GATE program as correlated with notions that were put out by, who's the guy who wrote The Veldt?
I've never heard of that.
Ray Bradbury, I want to say. The Veldt is the short story. A lot of people read it in public school. I had to read it at one point. Hold on. Jamie, pull that up.
Jamie, pull that up.
Ray Bradbury. Okay, it's Fahrenheit 451 guy. I wanted to make sure it was Bradbury, but the very interesting piece on what modern propaganda looks like, and it's just stupidly complex. We have our first female writer. We're officially a progressive publication after that.
Awesome. Oh, I think that's legitimately great. I think that real diversity is good. Like diversity of thought and opinion and getting different perspectives. I think that's a good thing. I think that our current conception of it is garbage, but I think that, as somebody who likes all different types of information, it has been accused. I was once accused in the same day of being a hard R lover and a Nazi, which I thought was great, and I posted it because that's what I'm going for. But sorry, continue.
No, that's funny. But our first female contributor with an article on female beauty standards and objective notions of beauty.
That's the diversity I want. Like, that's great. I would have never written that article because I don't care. I care to read it, not write it. But yeah.
It's an interesting one. It's good on public history as well and art. Really funny short one. That one's not even it's not a super serious historical dissertation, but it's called Propaganda, the Deed. And it's talking about the ridiculous stuff you find in textbooks.
Nice.
It's very funny. But then another interesting one, you've probably seen this guy's threads. He has like 100 followers. His name's Trevor. And he just rails against Indian academia and anthropology.
Really?
Like Indian, not Native American.
No, I get it. Yes. Yeah. It's I knew because you said it's a bad Indian academia is garbage. It's really bad.
Well, they end up getting popular with nonsense ideas in the West because it fits into the progressive framing of white people ruined everything and actually non-white people had everything figured out and then white people stole it from them.
Meantime, it's just Hindu nationalism incarnate.
It's just Hindu nationalism. There's this guy C.K. Raju who's a particular professor, and it's not like the most narrative building piece, but it just takes every single claim this guy has made in his professional career and dissects it, which is very It's cathartic almost. It's fun.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then we
No,
have
that's
your
great.
article, and then we have the LV Spartan War Poetry article. Oh, we have Charles's article in there as well. That was one that I initially
Charles
didn't
Haywood?
put out in the list thread. Oh no, it'd be cool to get Charles Haywood. This is C-Wing. I don't know how to pronounce his Twitter name, but C-Wing. He's written for I Am 1776. He recently had that great Boeing article.
I think I read.
And he wrote on Roman augury and divination as a political tool of propaganda, which is a crazy compelling piece that doesn't even deal with like politics. It's just a very interesting thing to read.
Yeah, I can't wait to read that. That's awesome. I'm familiar with some stuff in that. That's incredible. I will be reading it. I already bought 3 copies of it. I'm going to buy a 4th to send to Professor Alexis Dudden, who is my biggest academic mentor. She's incredible. And yeah, that's fantastic. Cool, man.
Well,
Volume 5.
People probably think we're fascists.
Well, I mean, I'm sure whatever. She's an East Asian history professor, and she's heard, like, I took like 3 or 4 classes, including my undergrad thesis with her. I mean, like, she's not going to be surprised by anything that I've written or the other things there. She is a legit traditional academic. It's awesome. She loves it. She's also one of the foremost experts on East Asia and Japan. Like, when there were times in class when I would, when something would happen in the news with North Korea, and I would be like, oh, well, we got a sub, or class is going to be canceled because she's going to be flying to DC or Japan or South Korea. And that's what happened. And then she'd be on NBC News talking about Korea and Japan. Yeah. So yeah, buy volume 5, follow Alaric on Twitter, and buy the other ones as well. I think my favorite is the Exploration edition, which is what I originally, what was that, volume 2 that I was going to write for the Francis Drake article, which is just sitting there now. It's a shame.
You should finish it. We can definitely publish that.
Yeah. So actually, on the last thing, unless you have anything else to say, what is the next upcoming volume, if you want to share it?
I don't have the specific theme for the next one locked in yet. Okay. I like to do it with sort of what's current and what's interesting people. So after this one comes out, I'll get feedback, see what people are interested in, go from there. Awesome. Thinking there are a couple in mind, but I don't want to announce it yet before it's solid. So
yeah, I do know what was talked about, what it was going to be, but I won't say it if you don't want it to be public yet, which I am excited about that topic.
5 or 6. So should be cool.
6 or 7, you mean?
Oh yeah, 6 or 7.
Yeah.
I'm losing count of my own books.
That's all right. That's a good thing to lose count of. All right. So anything else you want to plug, or are we all set here?
My normal stuff, read Bronze Age Mindset, join a fight gym, learn to beat people up. It's good for you. that's generally, people take away one message from what I put out on social media. I hope it's that. The history stuff is obviously, what I mostly talk about, but there's praxis to this.
Absolutely. So. And this is going to be a perfect segue. This is going to be episode 59, and then 59, and then episode 60 is going to be with Alaric. I'm sorry, not Alaric, JD Sturker, who is the fitness coach that I am, that now sponsors the podcast, as well as Jay Burden and Meta Prime sponsors them as well. So it's a good segue into that, and I fully agree. I have a large garden in my backyard that includes a boxing bag hanging from a tree in the outside where I do my boxing. Sweet, man. Thank you so much for giving me your time, and this will be out soon, and I cannot wait to read the rest of the articles in volume 5.
Yeah, thank you for having me on. Definitely looking forward to sending volume 5 out. Your essay was great in it. Thank you for contributing.
Thank you. I wasn't even sure I was going to be up to par. I haven't written in years, so thank you for including it.
That's great. It absolutely fits in. But yeah, I think that's a solid podcast episode.
Absolutely.